Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Helen Suzman Foundation and our partners, the Gordon Institute of Business Science, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Liberty, the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at UCT, and the Open Society Foundation for South Africa, I want to welcome you to the 5th memorial lecture in honor of Helen Suzman. I wish to call on Professor Nicola Klein, the Deputy Dean of Gibbs, to say a few words of welcome. Nicola.
Evening, ladies and gentlemen. To many of you who are returning to Gibbs, a warm welcome back here. I was absolutely delighted to receive the invite to welcome you here tonight on both a personal level and a school level. I was privileged to attend the school where Helen Suzman was at school, Parktown Convent, and I was reflecting back today about the role of role models and what role models stand for, and it was something that was inculcated in us were ideals and learning from people, and Helen Suzman was certainly somebody who I was exposed to very early in my life, largely because of the role that she'd played and because of the importance of voice and having opinion and speaking our truths and engaging to reconcile our truths. And I suppose it's no accident that I've ended up in a school that welcomes this as well. My dean, Nick Benedell, who unfortunately could not be here tonight, has a wonderful chalkboard in his office that says this is no ordinary school. And it's been a fascinating process for me this year, welcoming a number of educators who have come to Gibbs and said, but you do such different things here. And I don't think it's that we're different. I think it's just that we seek to promote conversation amongst non-traditional stakeholders at a business school. Most of the business schools that I visit are extremely focused on their core audiences, the students who need to be educated, the corporates who are going to manage. But of course, as has been often said, if we don't have a country, we don't have a business. And if we're not fostering the conversations around what will make the continent and, of course, our country vibrant, thriving, a place for all, a place where there's equal access to opportunity, we really don't have a business school. So I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming you all here. Thank you so much, Francis, for the invitation. And enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. These lectures seek to honor not only Helen's extraordinary contribution to public life as a very public figure in Parliament, but they also seek to uphold the values that she brought to public service in and out of Parliament. These values were characterized by informed and reasoned discourse, by fairness and equity, by the protection of human rights, and the defense of the rule of law. These are the values which we have sought to emulate in the work of the Foundation named in her honor. With your permission, I would very briefly like to review some of our projects which are informed by the values which Helen brought to public service. The first is the publication of our journal Focus, which seeks to create a forum for intellectual debate. Likewise, our roundtable series serves as a forum for policy debate. Our work on strategic health reform seeks to give concrete meaning to the belief that social justice is intimately connected to the protection of human rights. In this regard, the HSF has been actively involved in debates around the National Health Insurance Green Paper, the demarcation debates around medical schemes and health insurance, the Competition Commission's market inquiry, and we are engaged in an ongoing project concerning the delivery of medicines to the people of South Africa. This involvement with the delivery of health services is in line with our Constitution's aim of the progressive realization of rights. Growing out of our long involvement with the challenges we as a society face in the delivery of justice, the HSF has embarked on a project known as Project Constitution, which aims to provide senior high school learners with the basic principles that underpin our constitutional democracy. Through this program, we've been able to recruit some 25 LLB students and other students from BITS to assist with its delivery, which has now gone global, with our program manager conducting training sessions with Harvard Law School students on Skype. Our Delivery of Justice program also laid the foundations for our legal interventions, beginning with our role as amicus in the Glenister case concerning the independence of the Hawks. More recently, we have challenged the constitutionality of the SAPS Amendment Act concerning the independence of the Hawks. Likewise, our Delivery of Justice project paved the way for our litigation concerning the processes used in judicial appointments. It's my very pleasant task to inform you this evening that the Foundation's work has grown in both scale and scope, and that our financial position is stable. I think the people, we are by no means rich, okay, but we are solvent. And here I wish to pay tribute to our funders, to our donors, and to you, the friends of the Foundation, for your contributions so that we can continue through our work to honor Helen Suzman's legacy. And it is fitting that tonight's lecture is delivered by a man whose contribution to public service was much admired by Helen Suzman, even when that admiration was a critical one, as we would expect from Helen. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my very great pleasure to introduce Trevor Manuel. He is, as he once sharply pointed out to me when I introduced him on a previous occasion, a sometime actor and activist. We believe that he'll be, for the rest of his life, an activist, and we hope that our faith in him, in his activism, is well-founded, because I believe it is. He's a former Minister of Finance, a former minister in the Presidency in charge of the National Planning Commission. He has recently joined the private sector. Trevor, I caution you as a former banker, banking is the second oldest profession. It's subject to all sorts of abuse. Please be careful, because bank bashing is a terrible thing. And having been bashed by critics of the banks, I always urge you to be careful. His tenure as finance minister during the presidencies of Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Kgalema Motlanthe was illustrious. And the work he presided over as head of the Planning Commission seeks to lay the foundations of a more just, equitable, and prosperous South Africa within the context of a constitutional democracy. Without further ado, I call on Trevor Manuel to deliver the 5th memorial lecture in honor of Helen Suzman. Trevor has indicated that he will take questions after the lecture. Trevor Manuel, thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. Good evening to all of you. I observe a few notables in the audience. I'd like to welcome Ahmed Katada, comrade, leader, friend, mentor. I also want to welcome former cabinet colleague, fellow parliamentarian, the Honorable, still parliamentarian, the Honorable Buthelezi. I'd like to welcome Justice Edwin Cameron. I'd like to welcome Baroness Chalker. Now, who am I missing? When you start like this, you always end up in trouble. Of course, apart from everything else, today is Remembrance Day. And so it is fitting that we have this lecture on this day. It's also the day, incidentally, when we placed before the President the proposed National Development Plan, 11/11/11/2011. We were, of course, ready at 11 in the morning to do it. They weren't, but there you go. Now, Francis, the admission you've made this evening about the solvency of the Foundation is something I take note of. With the amount of litigation you're doing, I have a sense that there may be one of these personal injury lawyers involved, and you're using this for fundraising and nothing else, but there you go. You know, in the preparations for this evening, I shocked Francis, because I thought that we should change the topic. My basic suggestion, and the one that appears to have caused all manner of reverberations in the foundation, was to publish the following quotation as an overture for the discussion of our Constitution, the role of civil society in maintaining our democracy. And the quotation is, "The disposition to admire and almost to worship the rich and powerful, and to despise, or at least to neglect persons of poor and mean condition, is a great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments," unquote. Now, it felt, certainly when I spoke to Gary Rafe subsequently, that I was bringing Stalin into the house. I think it's a good quote because it certainly invokes a kind of shock that it does. And there's a palpable relief when one explains that these are words from Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, which was published in 1759, almost 100 years before the Communist Manifesto. In fact, the other durable literature from the same period is Oliver Goldsmith's poem, The Deserted Village, published in 1770. And Goldsmith's haunting words include, and I quote, "Ill fares the land, so hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. Princes and lords may flourish or may fade, a breath can make them as a breath had made. But a bold peasantry, their country's pride, when once destroyed, can never be supplied," unquote. These two contemporaneous pieces of literature, now some 250 years old, speak to a profound set of difficulties that faced what is now the UK. The question in the current context that arises is, what do our writings of the present reflect? And how would they be read 250 years hence? Who's admired? Who flourishes? Who's despised? And who's in the process of being destroyed? These questions arise from the perennial debate about the values in society. Surely the most important challenges of this milieu are poverty and inequality. Granted, these are not uniquely South African challenges, but they assume a particular significance because of our struggle for liberation was driven by so much hope, and the Constitution in its making brought so much promise. All of these experiences are so recent to still be fresh in all of our minds. Keep having to pinch myself and remind myself that our Constitution is only 18 and a half years old. The inequalities that Smith and Goldsmith wrote of remain so very current and so very topical. The concern that we should all express in the context of a discussion about the Constitution is the risk that for many, it may appear that the constitutional promise is now either already extinguished or deferred. So I want to invite you into a discussion that we must have if we consider our responsibilities in the context of our Constitution. I want to emphasize that we've achieved much in our young democracy. But if we want to drive this nation forward on an inclusive basis, then we must talk about those challenges that present, and which, if left unattended, may sully the very achievements we are so proud of. Inequality is prime among the challenges that confront us. You may argue that all of this is a consequence of economic policy decisions only, but it's important that we consider the constitutional context. Pause and reflect again on the preamble, on the promise of the very Constitution we adopted with those three short words, "so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights, to lay the foundations for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law, to improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person, to build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations." Broad, far-reaching, dynamic preamble that remains a durable commitment to each one of us as South Africans. Granted, our much admired constitution is about much, much more than the binding objectives articulated in the preamble. We will need to distinguish between the constitutional form, a democracy with regular elections, a voiced parliament, not like I see now, but a voiced parliament, an independent judiciary, and an accountable executive. All of those are fundamentally important victories secured. They did not exist in South Africa before democracy. Yet I submit that they are merely the form of democracy. We can tick all of the boxes for these claims. We must, however, turn our attention to the substance of democracy. Are we moving in a direction that continually improves the quality of life of all citizens and frees the potential of each person? Are we creating a sense of a rising flow of rights and opportunities? And are we consciously creating a sense of hope, measured by the feeling that each day is better than the previous one? In this context, we need to consider that it's entirely possible that we can tick all the boxes correctly about the form of our Constitution, yet avoid dealing with the substance thereof. What do we want, and what should we expect? Even in the discussion on sustaining our constitutional democracy, there's one common assumption that we all want the same things, but that we may choose different paths to get there. This is simply not true. It's unfair to assume that the poor who are dependent on a salary for their income, public services provided by the state, and whose daily experiences are so vastly different from the wealthy, want the same things. The rich derive income from accumulated wealth. They are able to acquire services that they need from the marketplace, such as private education, private healthcare, and security. The disparities are much greater than simply a matter of income and services. So how do we sustain our constitutional democracy? And do we, a gathering such as we are, have the absolute right to determine what the needs and expectation of others ought to be? I reflect on a discussion on his 80th birthday with somebody not recognized as a left-wing or a particularly strong Democrat, Lee Kuan Yew, who asked the question, how do you build a democracy in a society as unequal as South Africa is? Perhaps one of the biggest obstacles to overcome as we grapple with the challenge of sustaining our constitutional democracy is the sense that the circumstances of parents serves as too great a determinant of the opportunities available to their children. And that in the main, these circumstances are a direct product of our history. So in large measure, the landscape of opportunities still reflects the apartheid contours. And this is without Steve Hofmeyr and Dan Ruitt. It still reflects it. This is not to deny the fact that opportunities for the advancement of blacks and women, which was not possible under apartheid, now exist. We must also recognize that the statutory and institutional mechanisms created to advance the interests of persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination, in the words of the Constitution. This has resulted in the advancement of significant numbers of historically disadvantaged people. But for the majority, those opportunities still remain out of reach. These trends over the past 20 years are actually quite disturbing. In 1995, the poorest 40% of the population received about 6% of national income. Today, the figure is slightly below 6%. Of course, the economy is now much larger, notwithstanding a massive expansion of social grants. In 1995, the top 20% of income earners earned about 72% of national income. That figure today has fallen to 70%. For the top 10%, however, the figure has actually increased. More starkly, the unemployment rate for young black South Africans stands at over 50%. The comparable figure for white South Africans is below 10%. Notwithstanding significant social change, the chasms remain unbearably large. The problem of growing inequality is, of course, masked by the mathematics of aggregation and averages. For elites, like all of us in this room, there's a sense of boundless accumulation which may numb our senses to the harsh lived reality for the majority. Robert and Edward Skidelsky, in their authoritative book, How Much is Enough? Money and the Good Life. How much is enough, I think, works in the context of this book. I don't think it works in the context of ads, but there you go. They write, experience has taught us that material wants know no natural bounds, that they will expand without end unless we consciously restrain them. Capitalism rests precisely on this endless expansion of wants. That is why, for all its success, it remains so unloved. It has given us wealth beyond measure, but has taken away the chief benefit of wealth, the consciousness of having enough, unquote. And so to the point of capitalism having given wealth beyond measure, I must add, misery without measure for the majority. It brings me back to the extract from the preamble to our Constitution. And yes, forgive me, we're still on page 2 of the Constitution. There are 178 pages to come. That defines its very purpose. We adopted the Constitution so as to do a whole range of things. Improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person stands out from our preamble very strongly. So what do we ask of civil society to do in order to check the excesses of some and to open opportunities for the many? The first provocation is that it would help tremendously if we were neither neutral nor indifferent to the unfolding realities. We need an understanding among the elites in society that they must be part of the problem and the solution. Secondly, we must expand our understanding of the development impelled by a focus on capabilities, which is defined as concrete powers of thought and action. And thirdly, we should engage in discussion about how we should assert the voice of those who feel excluded. And fourthly, we must revisit our common purpose. So let's try and unpack some of the means to open opportunities for the many. What would we want to happen in South Africa? How far would we push the envelope? What would civil society wish to do with their powers to sustain our constitutional democracy? Let's return to what the organs of civil society might consider. Firstly, in working to counteract the complacency that comes from indifference, we fail to appreciate that the burden borne by the poor in South Africa goes way beyond the absence of jobs and money. There are a range of deep social problems that affect the poor and the impoverished communities in ways that metrics developed by economists, Iraj, don't always reach. We must be bold to draw the links between the realities of inequality and poverty and their manifestations in infant mortality, criminality, unemployment, malnutrition, teenage pregnancy, illegal drug use, alcoholism, gangsterism, and associated ills. The deep tragedy is that frequently a very rapid addiction to some hard-hitting drug, such as methamphetamine, leads into gangs and then petty theft that strips every material object that the family has accumulated. Ask Dedeline James, the mother from El Dorado Park, who wrote to President Zuma to plead on behalf of the community, and that is a story that is told and retold and lived and relived. Because I'm saying it goes beyond the money metric of what poverty is in reality. Add to this high levels of personal indebtedness, primarily from unsecured lending that shackle the poor and drive them back into the abyss of poverty as soon as they are able to raise their heads above the precipice. So if civil society wants to act to preserve our constitutional democracy, there's a veritable smorgasbord of opportunities. I want to invite you to follow closely the litigation brought by the University of Stellenbosch's Legal Aid Clinic against the Ministers of Justice and of Trade and Industry, the National Credit Regulator, 13 micro-lenders and a law firm. If the case succeeds, and I'm not a judge, I can express an opinion, I certainly hope that it will, the legality of emolument attachment orders, or garnishee orders as we call them, and the days of unscrupulous and exploitative micro-lending will end. With it, a small chink of light of the promise of our Constitution. It's taken a while and some dogged determination of some very resolute people, including employers who cannot bear to see the impoverishment of their employees, to bring the matter this far. The rest of us cannot merely cheer on their efforts. There's much work for the organizations of civil society to liberate people from the trappings of poverty. But do understand that engaging in support of the poor and exploited people denied access to the joys of our Constitution might actually lose you some friends. The problem of rising inequality cannot simply be placed at the door of the government, regardless of how you might feel about the general performance of government and where you might make your cross in an election. Babu Sheng. The World Bank study released last week confirms that fiscal policy is significantly redistributive on both the tax and spending sides, but it's not enough. The stark reality is that inequality will remain high until we campaign together for job creation. It's not a matter that can and should be left to either the government or the trade union movement alone or together. What distinguishes South Africa from our peer group countries, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, and Uruguay, as reflected in the World Bank study last week, is that a much smaller percentage of our compatriots have actually found work. Regardless of how redistributive spending is, we will not deal with inequality without creating large numbers of additional jobs. This is a topic that has to involve current and prospective employers. We can easily get trapped into a discourse where investment is weak, growth is weak, social mobility ceases, and social tensions rise. This raises the probability of populist policies, which threaten investment. It's up to all of us, the elites included, to break the cycle. It's worth repeating that merely being the proud owners of our Constitution, such as we have, without working to implement its spirit, is actually quite futile. The second provocation requires us to unlock the essence of what the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen called the capabilities approach. In his book, Development is Freedom, he argues that there are 5 components in assessing capability. The importance of real freedoms in the assessment of a person's advantage. Secondly, individual differences in the ability to transform resources into valuable activities. Thirdly, a multivariate of activities giving rise to happiness. Fourthly, a balance of materialistic and non-materialistic factors in evaluating human welfare. And fifthly, a concern for the distribution of opportunities within society. Surely we must be able to measure the value of the freedoms articulated by our Constitution to empower people to develop this courage of thought and action that Sen speaks of. Access to employment and the skill set to exercise choice in employment opportunities are fundamental to unlocking the energy produced by a capabilities approach. In understanding this aspect of our democracy, we re-enter the zone of substance rather than mere form of our democracy. So how do we unleash the courage of thought and action? Obviously, it must come from the nurturing in society by virtue of a rational redistribution. I'd like to tie this up with the work of another great economist, very fashionable, the poster boy at the moment, a man called Thomas Piketty, in his much talked about book, Capital in the 21st Century. He helps resolve the capabilities problem and the problem of inequality as follows, and I quote, "Modern redistribution does not consist in transferring income from the rich to the poor." Now you can exhale, it's okay. Whew. Or at least not in so explicit a way. It consists rather in financing public services and replacement incomes that are more or less equal for everyone. In the latter case, the principle of equality often takes a form of quasi-proportionality between replacement incomes and lifetime earnings. For education and health, there is a real equality of access for everyone, regardless of income or parents' income, at least in principle. Modern redistribution is built around a logic of rights and a principle of equal access to a certain number of goods deemed to be fundamental, unquote. So what, for the majority of South Africans, impedes the attainment of these fundamental rights? We should raise education very strongly under this topic. If Alex van der Heever weren't in the House, I'd also raise health, but I'm afraid of going there. And in this context, there are three issues that are worth exploring. First, whether the right is articulated strongly enough in Clause 29 of the Bill of Rights. The second question we have to answer is whether the education function is adequately resourced, as Piketty asks for. And thirdly, whether there are other impediments that we should be conscious of. In respect of the first issue, I'll take the plunge. In the presence of so many lawyers, and Peter Leon is in the House, I will take the plunge and proffer a view that the language in Clause 29 could have been stronger. As it stands, a phrasing about the right to a basic education and to further education may not quite be as unambiguous as it could be, perhaps when read with Section 28.2. A child's best interests are of paramount importance in every matter concerning the child. It becomes a bit clearer. Perhaps we should raise the issue for further discussion. So there should never be a doubt about the intention of the clauses in relation to education. Secondly, in respect of finances, I'd hazard that we do not have a problem. In the current fiscal year, the state provides 190.7 billion, that's with a B, for basic education, of which 144.2 billion is for compensation, 18 billion for goods and services, etc. And over and above the 190.7, there's an additional 52.5 billion for post-school education. I think that the allocations by the National Treasury pass the Piketty test. But what does it buy? The third component to understanding whether we are equipping a generation of young people with capabilities is, of course, the conduct of teachers themselves. Nowhere is this more clearly articulated than in the papers and resolutions of the recently held SATU conference. Mr. Mondli Makanye recently wrote of this conference in the City Press, and I quote, "With education having been universally identified as the most effective tool to take society forward, it would stand to reason that those who stand in the way of a better educated society are an impediment to progress. And with the most evidence pointing to the fact that SATU's bullying tactics stymie efforts by government, parents, civil society and hard-working teachers to improve the education system, the union is definitely an obstacle to progress," unquote. What value does our rights and freedoms guaranteed in the Constitution have if we are not able to conquer the fundamental challenge of unlocking the capabilities in society? We'll not advance the cause of equity and inclusion unless we can campaign together to produce better outcomes from our spending in education, tackling those who impede the passage of the children of the poor, as Mondli Makanye does, might be one of the responsibilities that civil society might have to shoulder. It brings me to the third provocation. It's mortar, please. In the battle to deal with the challenges presented by inequality, we need to consider the functioning of democracy as provided for by our great Constitution. Thanks, Francis. I was persuaded by the arguments of President Michelle Bachelet in the Nelson Mandela lecture she delivered in Cape Town on the 9th of August this year. She analyzed the quality of democracy everywhere, a bold approach in an environment where so many citizens now have access to information from a variety of sources. She commented on the fact that the hallmark of democracy sets a legal frame for regular elections of representatives. What struck me about her address was the fact that she argued that basic standards of legality and representative democracy was simply no longer enough for citizens. This is in the context of the civility of institutions, her word, and with regards to rights already achieved. She made the compelling point, and I quote, On top of demands for democracy and equal distribution of opportunities, goods and services, the demand for participation is essential, unquote. How would this participation be achieved by organs of civil society, and what are the risks? There are various initiatives to close the gap between elections. The Swiss system of frequent referenda and the Californian system of propositions stand out amongst these. There remains, of course, an enormous risk that some of the propositions may produce outcomes that may not articulate with our constitutional values. You'll have a big job then, Justice. I mean, a proposition on whether we should pay taxes or e-tolls or introduce the death penalty. I know where that will go, so, you know. The question is whether the risks outweigh the opportunity to explore the argument presented by President Bachelet on the inadequacy of sticking to merely the standards of legality. In many respects, legislation and funding allocations provide for a closing of the gaps between citizens and political power. I've established that the parliamentary system, and that is the National Assembly and 9 provincial legislatures together, will spend approximately 800 million rand this year to support its 860 members to perform their responsibility by engaging the electorate, by closing the information gap and dealing with the needs and lived experience of citizens. The averages are quite amazing. The numbers average out at 1 elected representative, that's only national and provincial, for each 65,000 people, and give or take and allocated approximately 1 million rand each to serve the electorate. And to these numbers, we must add the actions and spend by directly elected ward councillors. I thought that there'll be a shock now. The Constitution in section 42.3 says, and I quote, "The National Assembly is elected to represent the people and ensure government by the people under the Constitution," unquote. To enable the principle of government by the people, the parliamentary program is so adjusted that its members are required to be in Cape Town for parliamentary committees and sittings for about 3 days of the week. Mondays, weekends, and of course, the periods that coincide with school holidays are set aside for constituency work. While Fridays, according to the rules, are parliamentary working days, it is seldom used for plenaries with only a handful of committees that meet. You'll find the planes from Cape Town chockers on a Thursday evening. All citizens should know how the system works for them in closing the gap between officialdom and their daily lives. By now, of course, I've lost the last few friends I had who are MPs. This is not an unimportant point in the context of this evening's discussion. We are remembering Helen Suzman, perhaps the most tireless of MPs, in spite of having been a sole representative for so long a period of time. So my question to civil society is, why are you so tolerant? If President Bachelet is correct and mere representative democracy is not enough, how do we energize democracy? My sense is 800 million rand a year buys a lot of democracy, but I don't know how it touches us. I don't know how it reaches us. I don't know if the other 59,999 of us who share the same MP or MPL know them, engage with them, and they bring democracy into our lives. This is one occasion where I think the numbers should speak to us. The final provocation is, what exactly is our common purpose? Perhaps the most persuasive articulation of common purpose is expressed in the Constitution itself. Earlier I drew on the preamble, that well-crafted, cogent piece that gives us purpose. It doesn't stand alone, of course. It's followed by the founding provisions that similarly leave no space for guesswork. It lists the following values: human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms; non-racialism and non-sexism; the supremacy of our Constitution and the rule of law; universal adult suffrage, a national common voter's role; regular elections, and a multi-party system of democratic government to ensure accountability, responsiveness, and openness; and defines citizenship by stating that all citizens are, firstly, equally entitled to the rights, privileges, and benefits of citizenship, and secondly, equally subject to the duties and responsibilities of citizenship. So there are clearly no problems whatsoever with our Constitution or the clarity of argument used to set the course for transition. I would imagine, Justice Cameron, that the court, no court, would ever have to think very hard to answer the question, what was in the mind of the legislators when they drafted these founding provisions in our Constitution? No cause for equivocation, no cause for ambiguity. It is abundantly clear. There is a purpose set out, a series of rights and obligations that are followed through, of course, in the Bill of Rights itself. The language is so clear. I mean, it says, for example, law conduct inconsistent with it is invalid. The obligations imposed on it must be fulfilled. Not may, not should, must be fulfilled. It's clear. There's no stronger language possible in constitutional law. The problem seems to be that we've forgotten why we coexist in the same geographic space. The author Tony Judd speaks directly into this vacuum of purpose when he wrote, and I quote, "If we remain grotesquely unequal, we shall lose all sense of fraternity. And fraternity, for all its fatuity as a political objective, turns out to be the necessary condition of politics itself. The inculcation of a sense of common purpose and a mutual dependence has long been regarded as a linchpin of any community. Acting together for common purpose is a source of enormous satisfaction in everything from amateur sports to professional armies. In this sense, we've always known that inequality is not just morally troubling, it is inefficient," unquote. So if civil society is asking for a re-examination of its role, it has to be that because it does not need permission, it has to be that because it doesn't actually need permission, certainly not from me. There are 4 provocations that I submit it has to respond to. Firstly, the indifference to what we see, feel, and hear, and bear in mind that Helen Suzman lived by the motto, "See for yourself." Secondly, the need to focus on the concrete power of thought and action or capabilities that the key public services must unlock. Thirdly, the energizing of our democracy by paying close attention to both the representative and participatory elements thereof. And fourthly, re-establishing our common purpose. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, our Constitution is drafted in a manner that sets an enormous ongoing task to create a society that not only deals with the deficits of the past, but one that is considerably better for all of us. The deviation from this path is measured by the gross inequalities that obtain. We can and must use this fact as a measure of our collective neglect. It can and must be dealt with because we know that it will not self-correct. The actions required of us start with each of us making a choice about what we want our country to be. Thank you very much.
Trevor, many thanks for that inspiring, at times somber, always insightful address. Thank you. Trevor has indicated that he will take questions. I do ask that when you ask a question, 2 things. You identify yourself for the record, and the question is focused and to the point. Thank you.
My name is Mark Oppenheimer from the Johannesburg Bar. Mr. Manuel, you state that one of the core things that government should be focusing on is job creation. Now, job creation is like motherhood and apple pie. Everyone's in favor of it. So I'd like to try and get something specific out of you with reference to a particular change in government policy. The Labour Relations Act has recently been amended. One of those amendments is as follows. It'll prohibit employers from hiring people on a temporary basis. Everyone will have to be hired on a permanent basis. Now, to my mind, this has an impact on three different sets of parties: employers, employees, and the unemployed, who are often forgotten in these kinds of discussions. Now, it'll be the case that if you are an employee who's been employed on a temporary basis, who has to deal with the uncertainty of whether you're going to be able to have a job within a month or 3 months, depending on your short contract, that this law may seem like a very good thing for you. As an employer, you may have a concern that if you hire someone, that you might want to test someone out for a short period of time to see if they're suitable, and that you will no longer be able to do this. And there's a further concern that if you're unemployed, that your chances of being employed have been reduced. That this seems to protect particular sets of people, those that already have jobs, and can be to the disadvantage of those that don't. Okay. So my question is whether you would endorse such a policy, and if so, why?
Thanks very much. My name's David Ansara. In the beginning of your address, you cited Adam Smith, who is obviously a key thinker in terms of the origins of economics and our understanding of capitalism. And I was just wondering, I mean, if you look at Smith's idea of the invisible hand and the role that market forces play in bringing together goods and services and people who need and require those things, I mean, what role do you think the South African state should be playing in terms of increasing market forces in South Africa? Because at the moment it seems like the state is acting as an obstacle and sees itself as a developmental state, but is actually creating all sorts of market distortions in terms of specifically the assets that it owns, such as South African Airways and other state-owned entities, Eskom. So I'd like you to respond to that.
Thank you.
Peter Leon. Trevor, I'm not going to ask you a legal question, but a slightly political one, if I may, and an economic one. Just on the policy, on the constitutional side, though, you made, I thought, a very good point about the foundational provisions of the Constitution, talking about accountability, responsiveness, and openness. Just seems to me that the current administration, in many respects, seems to run away from those principles, whether one looks at the Nkandla Committee report, which I think came out today, and in fact the whole Nkandla issue. But I mean, there are a whole range of areas where constitutional institutions, such as the public protector, are attacked by it seems, members of the governing party. I'm not talking about the president, but other people in the party, where those issues are really taken to the fore, and I think rather belie some of or undermine some of the principles which the Constitution speaks to. The second question I wanted to ask you, though, is unrelated to that. You made a point about, I think a very good point, about the relationship between education and unemployment and how one can use that to address policy. One of the things that's always struck me about Brazil, despite the fact it has rather anemic growth rate this year, is that the Bolsa Familia, the system under which grants are transferred to poor families, are conditional upon educational undertakings that the families, the parents of those children, have to send those children to school. It's always struck me as somewhat anomalous that in South Africa, where we've been very successful at rolling out child grants, those don't seem to be linked to an obligation to send those children to school. And wouldn't that be a very simple step for the government to take in terms of addressing the link between education and poverty, which we really need to deal with?
Peter Leon's questions. I made a point at a similar gathering the other day about the public protector, not meaning to denigrate her. The legislation is abundantly clear. Unlike almost any other institution, you can't badmouth the public protector. But the point I make is that there's an over-reliance on an office such as the public protector, which is Chapter 9. It's to support. And my view of an office such as a public protector is that it's actually the spare wheel. It comes into flourish when the rest of the organs of democracy are not functioning as they should. And my reason for picking on members of parliament and provincial legislatures, and the fact that they each have R1 million available per year to bring them closer to the population, is that if you are conducting clinics as members of parliament and in touch with your constituents, then the office of the public protector will not be as visible as what we have at the moment. And so the issue for me is actually how we can generate an interest amongst the people who serve us. Constitution 46(2) is clear. They're there to represent us, and they can't just represent us by being voted on a party list once every 5 years. What is the feedback? And I think it's more than just the system, the electoral system we have, because in local authorities where we have a split system of directly elected ward representatives and proportional representatives, the ward councillors, certainly in metros, are required by the Municipal Systems Act to have at least 4 report backs a year and resourced by the municipality. It exists as the exception, not the rule. Across party lines, it exists as the exception. Now, you see, the brief that was given to me this evening by the foundation is to talk about civil society. So I'm asking of civil society on that front this evening, why do you put up with public representatives who actually don't keep you informed, who close the gap? Linda Chalker is in the House of Lords. In the UK, you don't have a public protector. All that you have are MPs who are in direct contact with people. It's funded. So why don't we use the funding? Why don't we shift the debate on this issue? The second issue, I can't read my own writing. It's about conditionality. Well, the first point I'd like to make is, I'll invite people to look at the presentations that were made at that workshop. When was it? Wednesday last week in Pretoria, where the World Bank published the report. I mean, in GDP terms, our social security spending exceeds Bolsa Familia. And actually, I don't think that there's that much of a problem when I look at the enrollment rates in schools, especially in primary schools. Our enrollment rates for both girl children and boy children are pretty high. So it may not be that. It may be in the fact that we've not balanced out the issues of rights and responsibilities. And I don't know, I mean, you know, this is a very hotly debated topic. Sociologists and social development experts talk about how difficult it is to introduce conditionalities. So I'm persuaded that it might not be that. It's not that people don't care and keep their children from schools. I do think that if we were to look at what takes place in the classroom, in schools, in poor communities, and understood that better and made that investment differently, that parents may be encouraged to want to have their children in schools for longer. And for me, that is a big gap. It's that yawning chasm between urban elite who have access to all manner of exceedingly good schools in both the public and the private sector, and the schools. And you know what worries me is that in so many of the no-fee schools, and 60% of our schools are now no-fee schools, there are no school governing bodies. They've just fallen apart. Nobody convenes them. Nobody's interested in the voice of the parents. And so the chain of accountability is broken. I think that if we focused on these things, small as they may seem, we begin that process of reconstructing who we are and how we relate and what the responsibilities of each of us should be to each other. Now, Dave, your question starts with Adam Smith and then veers a little bit. I want to quote I could quote Trevor Manuel and talk about the shape of the markets and that they are amorphous, but I won't go there. I want to quote Joe Stiglitz, who recently spoke about the fact that markets have no ethics because that's not what they set up to do. They are means of exchange. And they facilitate an exchange of goods and services. And Sen, who I quoted here, says that markets are like prose. You can't communicate verbally without prose, and you can't communicate in trade without markets, so they exist. But if you think that they will deal with the issues of inequality in and of themselves, I would invite you to think again. Because I happen to be of the view that Adam Smith is terribly misunderstood. The reason why I started with the theory of model sentiments is because there's a much deeper meaning and a set of views that obtain, certainly in that period, and I think the issues of ethics and values in society were less partisan than what they are today. And so part of what we need is a little bit of economic history to help us through these things. So don't partition ourselves to say it has to be now the wealth of nations or the Communist Manifesto. I think that the entire science of economics has developed a heck of a lot since then, and there's a lot of current thinking that helps us try and bring these things together, and some of the people I referred to this evening help along those lines. The quotation from Piketty is actually from page 457, chapter 14, because most people have not read beyond page 40. The reason I raise it in an audience like this is that all South Africans need to be acutely aware of the risks of not dealing with a problem that then leads to populism and the unraveling of our constitutional values. Mark, the brief, and I'd like Francis to confirm this, the brief that he gave me this evening, I don't know if you put it in your flyers as well. The role of civil society in sustaining constitutional democracy. If, my learned brother, you are on the Johannesburg Bar, you are part of that civil society, so why are you looking to government? You see, part of what we need, I'm saying that the issue, and in the NDP, we try to communicate this time and again. Don't outsource your responsibilities to those who sit in parliament. You see, in the same way, this constitution we have, we can have it and be the proud owners of the constitution, or we can live its values. It's like social compacts. You can draft them and say, well, we drafted a compact on this day, now we're happy. We issued a press statement at the conclusion of that. It doesn't give meaning, it doesn't transform anything. Democracies that flourish because they are dynamic and they involve people. So yes, there are problems in the labor market. Yes, we need a different set of approaches. Part of what I said carefully was, what do they say? War is too important to leave to the generals? I think jobs are too important to leave to government. it's a society-wide issue. We seem to have forgotten that it's a society-wide issue. Carefully, I thought that the words I chose are, we must speak to current and prospective employers about this issue. It's not just for government and the trade unions. They can't have a duopoly of responsibility about this, because you'll make grave mistakes. These are insiders we're talking about. Society must be opened, and our responsibilities must shift. That if I didn't leave a message that we need to energize and dynamize our democracy through agents and organs of civil society, then I think I misspoke this evening. We must debate these issues differently. Thanks.
It may concentrate the mind if they get a bit hungrier. Are there any further questions? Prince.
Thanks very much, colleague. This wonderful Helen Suzman lecture. But concerning, just to remind you of some things, because you as a younger man should remind me at my age, but this time I reverse roles by saying that you remember when I appointed the Van Slabbert Committee as Minister of Home Affairs, which came out with a recommendation, at least the majority report recommended that we should have both systems, electoral systems, constituency and also the PR. And of course, the cabinet rejected it. Don't you think that if that was implemented, maybe this problem would not be as acute as it is today? And on the other hand, of course, regardless of the fact that we have chickened out.
Excuse me.
the development, our development program will be your legacy, whether you like it or not, if it succeeds. But I would like to share with you some of the concerns that I have about that, because you remember that President Mbeki appointed our then deputy president to address the issue of the rigidity of our labor laws. And then Mr. Mbeki came out with the growth, employment, and redistribution gear. You remember I went to the podium and said to you as ANC, to me, it was like a Damascene experience of soul going to, I was so excited about it. But shortly after that, what did we see on television? We saw the tripartite partners of the ruling party saying, we do not want gear, we do not want gear. And immediately, of course, it vanished. And of course, the development plan, all of us have endorsed it. I think it is the best wish list which the government has ever produced, I mean, during our times. But I have misgivings about whether it will be implemented in view of that history, because already, you know that there are noises already from tripartite partners concerning development plan. They're already sniping at it. And I wonder if that noise will not go into a crescendo soon and then to also vanish. I'm very jittery about that. I fear something of that kind might happen.
Thank you.
In view of that past history.
Thanks.
That has happened when we're colleagues together. Thanks.
Thank you. Question here.
Corinne du Plessis from City Press. Ms. Manuel, I've got a question. Right now in the news we're seeing COSATU, gosh knows, I don't know, breaking up, not breaking up, wanting to get back together again. What do you think NUMSA's expulsion means for the implementation of the NDP in the long term, if the expulsion holds?
Question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Mohlolo Khopane. There is a risk of repeating what the previous speakers have said around this burning issue of unemployment. Trevor, in the early 1998, I was very prominent as an unemployed person, advocating for the flexibility of the labor market. And one of the arguments that I raised together with the unemployed, as civil society activists representing that sector, we pushed that organized labor, in particular COSATU, has no right to speak on behalf of the unemployed. And we were vulgarized, rubbished, and said to be a cheap fodder for capital. That hegemonic role of the trade unions resulted in most of the unemployed being seen as reactionary and not being part of the Congress alliance tradition. In short, I'm trying to say that today there's a case that should be made that the unemployed have got the right to be exploited or not. Thank you.
Trevor. Is there one more question?
Thank you. Mr. Manuel, I think Peter referred to, he said grants being linked to sending children to school. You've said children, did I say my name? It's Jane Evans, if I forgot. You've said a lot of our children are at school. I think the question, which you've probably already answered, it's one thing getting children to school, the other is what is the quality of the education that they have a right to. Is the current education system going to raise young people out of poverty? And the question is, how do you energize parents to hold the school responsible and accountable, and government accountable for a decent rate of education? In terms of civil society, I'm involved at the early childhood development level. Were it not for civil society, I do not think South Africa would have had the foundations for early childhood development. It has, I'm talking from the pre-1994. I think when the new government came in, civil society, the NGO sector, had laid a foundation. But today, I think our young children, and the majority of them do not have access to ECD programs, deserve a much higher standard than they are getting. And there's a lot that concerns me. My question is, how does one energize, empower, help parents, hold government accountable to get the education system to where it should be?
Babusheng, yes, we can go back to the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission. I think, though, important as those recommendations are, unless the system is made to work, it doesn't actually change the substance. The point I was raising in response to Peter is, in the context of local government where we have the split system operating, it's actually no better. I mean, the Systems Act requires ward committees to be elected in open sort of public meetings. It doesn't happen. You see, nobody guards the guardians, because the problem is that citizens don't care about these things anymore. And my starting point is that if there is change in the quality of democracy, we will get better responses because citizens get involved in the process. It doesn't matter, because what Jane didn't say is that a large part, and we were talking about it earlier, I mean, when I think, Colin, when I think of the role of the faith community before 1994, when I think of the vast number of NGOs, bear in mind, I was on the other side, I was in the UDF. We had thousands of small organizations that came from nowhere, but they were there. That was voice. And when we first got to vote, everybody said, it's okay, we don't have to bother anymore. We've walked the journey. And I think it's there that the problem can be made to function differently. I mean, I know that if I were assigned a constituency of 65,000 people and I didn't turn up, there'd be a big noise about it. And if they heard that actually I'm only in Parliament for 3 of the 7 days a week, and over school holidays I'm meant to be with them, and I'm not, there should be a noise about it. I'm saying that when we switch off and hope that the mere fact that we have a constitution, there's this distinction made by one writer between to have and to be. You don't have to live it out, you can only have it. So we have the constitution, it's nice, it's beautiful. Look at the wonderful words, nice cover, test it in the courts. We can take that view of the constitution, or we can say the only approach that's sensible and rational is actually to unlock this constitution to empower our people differently. And that's what we're not doing as a society. The issues of gear, and I've got some witnesses. You must have 2 witnesses for whatever you do. Iraj is sitting over there and Maria is sitting at the back. The point about it is that we were in a very deep crisis, like the country is now, actually. And we had to take some decisions about fiscal policy and a whole range of other things. And we took those decisions and carried on. My sense about policy is you can't adopt a policy for all time. Economic policies change. GEAR did not replace the RDP. And as GISA merely sought to deal with what we analyzed to be binding constraints, and we sought to accelerate those in order to get better growth and to focus on inclusiveness. That's what we did. It didn't replace. You don't sort of say, well, we had GEAR yesterday, let's dump it, let's go for something else. It's an evolving process. And this I think, is quite important about that. But the problem, you're correct, Babushenge, about if we don't take these issues up, I don't think it's quite as negative. I mean, I speak of education. But there's the National Education Collaboration Trust, which is co-chaired by Sizwe Nxasana and Minister Angie Motshekga. And they are deploying people into districts. And they've mapped out some of the districts are dysfunctional because you've got poorly skilled people running the districts, and there's a sharper understanding of the schools, because you're not going to fix this by big announcements. My sense about education is there are 3 interfaces that you must fix. The teacher in the classroom. The principal as manager of the teachers. And the principal as key communicator with the community to construct that chain of accountability. If you get that, you fix education. It's not about big curriculum stuff. You can debate outcomes-based education, incomes-based. You can debate those things. But I think it's about fixing the interfaces and knowing that you've got systems of accountability. And my sense of what I'm picking up from the NECT, which interestingly and importantly is a public-private partnership. It's a bit expensive, but it's a public-private partnership that is actually getting out into areas that are outside of where the cameras go, and trying to fix on the ground floor, which I think is fundamentally important. Now, if we do those kinds of things, and you can't sequence something like the NDP, but if you fix those kinds of things, I think you have a better chance. It's one of those senses I have that if people taste the empowerment that Jane Evans is looking for amongst parents, then they use that same power to fix other things in society because they feel differently about themselves and their neighbors. So those issues I think are important. Karine, can we have this discussion while you and I run a marathon? which wouldn't be at your time, it would be at my time, which will give us about a week to run a marathon. Look, it's a very difficult issue. I don't know. I think Humpty Dumpty's fallen off the wall. I think for COSATU, Humpty Dumpty's fallen off the wall. I can't see anybody, all the king's horses and all the king's men, putting this Humpty together again. I think it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy, but the questions that present are, how do we get a voice for working people? And it's not the same voice as for the unemployed, but how do you get a voice for working people? Because I think that societies that function well are societies that maturely can carve out responsibilities for various segments. And if that part of it is broken, then it's going to be so much more difficult. I mean, we lived through 5 months of this year with an AMCU strike in the platinum sector. There's no reach, there's no ability to persuade, there's nothing. My learned brother, Mr. Oppenheimer there, I'm a bit more worried about the fact that when workers want to go on strike, there's no overseen balloting. Because if workers were balloted and their views known and percentages tallied, and the no work, no pay rule was properly understood, we may have different outcomes, and the strikes would probably be less violent as well. The point about Karine is I don't know where the workers' voice is because between what happened at 2:34 a.m. on Saturday morning and the announcement by unions who hadn't convened meetings that they were now leaving COSATU, I don't know where that mandating happened. But that's part of our problem we must talk about in the context of these kinds of issues. I'm sorry, I didn't hear Mohlolo. Mohlolo. Thank you. No, I think you're right about the issue. I don't know how we actually give adequate voice to the unemployed. One of the points I made in the talk was it is incorrect to assume that rich people and poor people want exactly the same things. I think by the same token, it's incorrect to assume that the employed and unemployed want exactly the same thing. Now, I think we must be very careful. We need a long discussion about how we are able, and bear in mind in the context of the NDP, just so that my father here doesn't, isn't too concerned when he has to sleep this evening. You see, one of the recommendations that comes out of the National Development Plan is a proposal for some incentive to support the employment of young people. And again, there was that toy asifuni youth employment subsidy. But government went ahead and implemented it, and it's actually one of the very successful programs. And I'm sure there will be moments like that where the worlds are tested. What is important is that part of what we need is a society-wide view. I mentioned some of the statistics, and the worrying statistics about those money metrics about inequality in South Africa. What happens top 10%, top 20%, what happens to the bottom 40%. Now, in the environment of the United States, that probably has the most flexible labor market ever. There was a report that was released about 4 weeks ago. Over the past 15 years, the incomes of blue-collar workers have fallen very considerably in real terms. Top 10% have taken off. The aggregates may tell you a story about massive growth in the US, but for the bulk of poor working people, their conditions have actually deteriorated, partly because even where there were rights, and I think of the Michigan-based auto plants where workers had post-retirement benefits such as pensions and health, it's all been taken away. Even in the city of Detroit, workers had to vote to take massive reductions in their pensions. When they're poor and have nothing else, those cuts are very, very deep cuts. So I'm saying, let's be very careful so that we don't swing the pendulum in the other way, which may actually exacerbate inequality in South Africa. I don't know what the answers are, but I do know that unless we can put the problem on the table and discuss the problem and not ideology. The problem is that too few people work, and when people don't work, their families don't have access to the most basic of resources. Too many family members are then dependent on fewer incomes. It's the exacerbation of inequality by any measure. We must resolve the problem. Call us names later, don't worry. Sticks and stones, break my bones. But what we must resolve are the fundamental problems that and if you go back to the diagnostic of the NDP, we lifted two things as the biggest challenges that present in South Africa. The first is that too few South Africans work. It was true then when we drafted the diagnostic almost 4 years ago, and it's truer now, and the problem hasn't been solved. And the second issue is that the outcomes for the majority of black learners in South Africa is suboptimal. It was true then, it's worse now. These are issues where I fervently believe civil society must come together and recognize that it takes more than good intent. It takes a lot of effort, and most people who pretend that they've got voice will run for cover when the community says, just explain yourself very nicely, please. That's my experience, and Francis reminded you I'm an activist. I was a civic activist. I'll probably return now in retirement to civic activism. But that voice is fundamentally important. Jane, I've tried to deal with parts of what you were raising. But in the National Development Plan, we dealt with the issue of early childhood development. Now, it's a multifaceted debate. On the one hand, the foundation years are so fundamentally important, and it's the foundation years that are not being adequately addressed because the gaps start from there. There's another report, more recent, I think it may be by Professor Sitfas van der Berg at Stellenbosch, who's tracked youngsters who've gone to grade R and says it makes no material difference. Now that scares me. It scares me because the NDP calls for 2 years of compulsory grade R. And so it's not how much money we spend, it's not whether we increase 190.5 to 290.5 billion rand if we could afford it. Your observation about the quality is right. And so my pleading is that it not be debated in the context of syllabus, but that we need to change the engagement of parents in the oversight. And I don't believe that there's a single parent in this country or anywhere in the world who couldn't care less about what happens in the lives of their children. And so the movement of school governing bodies, my view, too small as an organ of civil society, and it's reducing because the 60% of schools that are no-fee schools, virtually none of them have school governing bodies. And if the only relationship between a school and the parent community is the fact that parents have to contribute and therefore would come to meetings because they want some value for money, then we have failed at the first hurdle. It's about changing the relationship of accountability of schooling. You see, and so this discussion, I don't know where you take it because I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a pedagogue, I'm just a retiree for now, okay? But the key issue is when Clause 28 of the Bill of Rights, which deals with the rights of the child, speaks as it does about the best interests, how do you measure it? Not in failure, because that we can leave to the Concord. As it did with the Grootboom matter, you can measure that in failure. The key issue is how do you measure it in its advance? And it's in taking this approach to the Constitution that I think we can give it a life that's very different from saying, we are proudly South African, we have a wonderful Constitution. I think we must replace the verb have with the verb live. And that is why I'm fighting with civil society, because it has gone to sleep. Thank you.
Trevor, many, many thanks. I can see the activist coming back, and I'm delighted about that. I'd like to call on the HSF's chairman, Gary Rafe, to propose a vote of thanks. Thanks.
Minister Manuel?
No.
Not a minister. Mr. Manuel, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to have had you here this evening, Trevor, and if I may just be your praise singer, I didn't think Francis did a good job in singing your praises before, but of course we all know that from your activism in the struggle, in the UDF, you then turned out to be a remarkably conservative Minister of Finance, just the sort of person to manage our macroeconomic economy and at the same time devoted to fiscal prudence. When after that, in I think the first Zuma administration, you became minister in the presidency, there were some of us who allowed ourselves to be enticed by speculation in the press that you might be some sort of de facto prime minister. Listening to you this evening and the call, the inspiring words, and indeed the call of leadership, I can speculate that perhaps you're the best prime minister that the new South Africa, never had. And if I may, I know that Baba Shenga was teasing you when you said you had chickened out. I would rather paraphrase Shakespeare and said, nothing so became the man in his politics as the leaving of it. It's not just the wealth that we all admire, it's the power. It's not only the rich that cling on to their riches, it's the powerful who cling on to their power. And I think you have thereby set a very high standard in leaving that world behind you. Your profound words this evening and the differentiation between the form and the substance of the Constitution would have appealed enormously to Helen Suzman. Helen was contemptuous of form. She was deeply interested in the substance. And you're right to remind us that if any politician went out to sea, it was Helen. I don't know how many politicians today go out in the way that Helen did to visit the poor and to visit the dispossessed and to visit them at a time when actually they had absolutely no hope at all. We speak for all of us, for a crowded house, in thanking you for your inspiring words this evening, for energizing all of us, and that energizing has to go throughout the community. I remember last year visiting a primary school in Alexandra, and the woman who was with me immediately after the principal had finished her little presentation said, "What is the biggest problem you have in your school?" And she shot back right away that since '94, the parents have simply disengaged. They've taken on a culture of entitlement. That before '94, they were fighting for their children's education, and now they felt it was no longer them that were accountable. It was actually for the state to provide. So there is energizing that has to take place throughout our country. And you're right to remind us that today is Remembrance Sunday, and I think the message we take for that of Remembrance Sunday is people combining together for the cause they had at the time, and it really is the sort of day where you've issued a call to us to re-energize behind the common cause of how to do well by South Africa. Trevor, thank you very much indeed.